Chapter 5 of Hunting for Hidden Gold by Franklin W. Dixon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Con Riley, Under Fire. The blizzard died down as suddenly as it began, and when the Hardy Boys and their chums left the cabin, they found that the snow had ceased falling and that the sun was shining brightly. They found Jadbury Wilson's long sled tied to the outside of one of the cabin walls. It had been unharmed, and it did not take the boys long to place blankets upon it and make the old man comfortable. They had to assist him out of the cabin, so greatly did his injuries pain him. He had 2 pair of snowshoes, and Chet Morton and Jerry Gilroy donned them, the Hardy Boys being content to trudge along in the deep snow of the lake. In a short time they had left the cabin and were making their way toward Willow River, pausing frequently to rest because the deep snow soon wearied them. However, when they reached the river, they found that they made better progress because the stream was protected by high wooded banks and the snow had not drifted as deeply as on the lake. But it was mid-afternoon before they reached the road leading into Bayport. From there on their progress was easy, and dragging the sled with Jadbury Wilson wrapped in his blankets, they at length reached the Hardy home on High Street. Here they were all welcomed by Mrs. Hardy and Aunt Gertrude, who had been frantic with anxiety concerning the boys' whereabouts. "We were going to send out a searching party for you," exclaimed Mrs. Hardy as she kissed her sons and sent Chet and Jerry in to telephone their parents the news of their arrival. "I knew they'd get lost. I told them so," declared Aunt Gertrude vigorously, but if she had a scolding in store for them, she soon forgot it in her immediate concern over Jadbury Wilson, whom Chet and Jerry brought into the house. When the Hardy Boys explained the situation and told of their adventures and the reason for their delay, Mrs. Hardy was insistent that Jadbury Wilson should make his home with them until he could be on his feet again. "You'll certainly have to stay with us," she said. "There's plenty of room." "I'm sure I'm most thankful to you, ma'am," said the old prospector humbly. As for Aunt Gertrude, she was already scurrying about the kitchen, making hot ginger for the new guest, and when it was ready she stood over Jadbury Wilson until he had drunk the last drop. Then the boys put him to bed, and as the old man relaxed into the warm blankets, he sighed and remarked that it was the first time in 5 years that he had experienced the comforts of a soft mattress. Jerry and Chet hastened home, wondering a little what would be said to them, but their people were so relieved at seeing them again that they forbore to lecture the lads, and, all in all, they came through the ordeal better than they had expected. "Back to school tomorrow," grumbled Joe at supper that night. "Oh, didn't I tell you?" said Mrs. Hardy. "Tell us what?" "There won't be any school tomorrow." "What?" shouted the boys incredulously. "You should say, 'I beg your pardon,'" corrected Aunt Gertrude acidly. Mrs. Hardy smiled. "I thought you'd be surprised," she said, "and I suppose you'll be almost heartbroken. No, there's to be no school tomorrow. Last night's blizzard was one of the worst in the history of Bayport. The wind was so strong that it wrecked the high school roof." Joe gave a whoop of delight and danced around his chair. "There's nothing to cheer about that I can see," sniffed Aunt Gertrude. "They say the property damage was very bad, and it will take about 2 weeks before the roof is fixed." The news proved too much for the Hardy Boys. Like most youths of their age, the unexpected prospect of a winter holiday filled them with delight. Mrs. Hardy smiled at them indulgently, for she had not forgotten her own school days. Aunt Gertrude began laying down the law to the effect that the boys must pursue their studies at home quite as ardently as though the school had been undamaged, and on the following day she actually did insist that they do 2 hours studying before they got out in the morning. When the boys finally made their escape and raced to the nearest hillside with their bobsleds, they found most of the students of the Bayport High School already there. Tony Preto, Phil Cohen, Biff Hooper, Chet Morton, and Jerry Gilroy were on hand, as well as many of the girls. Callie Shaw, of whom Frank Hardy was an ardent admirer, and Iola Morton, sister of Chet and the only girl who had ever won an approving glance from Joe Hardy, were hilariously bobsledding and looking unusually pretty in gaily colored sweaters and woolen toques, their eyes sparkling and their cheeks flushed with the cold. For half an hour or more the sliding continued, the boys having the time of their lives, and then Nemesis appeared on the scene in the person of Officer Con Riley. Now, as old readers know, Riley was the sworn enemy of the youth of Bayport, a stolid, thick-set individual with more dignity and self-importance than brains. He took the responsibilities of his position on the Bayport police force very seriously. He had the view, too common to the type of elderly people who have forgotten that they once were young, that all enjoyment is sinful and that all young people are continually up to mischief. So, when Con Riley saw the merry party on the hillside, he recollected an ancient and obsolete city ordinance forbidding bobsledding elsewhere than in the parks. This ordinance had originally been passed to prevent youngsters sliding down hills adjacent to the trolley tracks and thereby endangering their lives. The fact that there were no trolley tracks near this particular hill mattered nothing to Officer Riley. Majestically, he stood at the bottom of the hill and held up his hand. Sled after sled pulled to a stop, and Officer Riley, the personification of the majesty of the law, ordered the fun to cease. There was nothing to be done. Officer Riley had the authority, and he knew it. "Well," said Chet Morton grimly, "we'll just have to find our fun some other way. Let's have a snowball fight." Officer Riley looked dubious and produced a little notebook which he perused earnestly. He knew Chet Morton and his mischievous proclivities of old, but although he looked through the rules and regulations hopefully, he could find nothing to prohibit snowballing. However, he withdrew to the street and paced slowly up and down in the faint hope that perhaps a stray snowball might break a nearby window, in which case he would have a delicious opportunity to interfere once more with the sport. Chet gathered his cohorts and talked earnestly for a few minutes. Then, with many giggles, his followers set to work building two snow forts directly opposite one another. The forts were merely rude snow embankments, just sufficient to provide protection for the opposing sides. Then the young people began rolling snowballs. So far, so good. Officer Riley was unable to detect anything wrong in this. Still, the fight had not started. There was still the hope of a shattered window pane. Majestically he paced to and fro, keeping a wary eye on the snow forts and the gaily clad figures behind the banks. Then, to his surprise, he saw Chet Morton walking slowly toward him. Officer Riley eyed Chet suspiciously. The fact did not escape him that Chet had one hand behind his back. "Aha!" he muttered. "A snowball." He was right. Hardly had the suspicion crossed his mind than it became a frigid reality. Chet seemed to aim at one of the forts, but his foot appeared to slip, and the snowball smacked Con Riley's helmet with deadly accuracy, knocking it off into the snow. Riley emitted a roar of rage and astonishment. Snow was trickling down his neck. He stooped merely long enough to pick up his helmet and thrust it back on his head, where it rested at a ridiculous and rather precarious angle. Then he gave chase to the rash youth who had thus tempted his wrath. Chet went plowing through the snow directly in between the forts. Con Riley plunged recklessly in pursuit. Even yet he did not suspect the trick, did not suspect that Chet was merely luring him on to destruction. Not until a second snowball whizzed past his head, not until a third smacked wetly against his ear, did he realize that he had plunged neatly into a trap. He floundered about in snow up to his knees, and from either side came a volley of snowballs. They squashed against his helmet, knocking it off again. They thumped against his uniform on every side. No matter which way he turned, flying snowballs met him, and the boys took good care to keep their faces out of sight. "Stop it!" he roared. But the merciless bombardment continued. He made a frantic rush toward one of the forts, but the snow was too deep to permit of rapid progress, and the air seemed full of white missiles. One snowball caught him in the eye and stopped his rush momentarily. He wavered. More snowballs caught him in the rear. He turned around, and a concerted bombardment opened up from each fort. Officer Riley decided that discretion was the better part of valor, and he ignominiously retreated. As for Chet Morton, he was safely ensconced behind a particularly heavy snowbank, laughing until the tears came to his eyes. When next he peeped out, he saw that Officer Riley, having retrieved his precious helmet, was making great speed back toward the comparative safety of the sidewalk. With the greatest dignity that he could command under the circumstances, he brushed the snow off his uniform. Then, sadly, he resumed his beat and headed toward the downtown part of Bayport, where citizens were more law-abiding and where snowballs were unknown. The Hardy Boys and their chums saw their enemy disappear around the block, and then Chet rose to the top of the ramparts and gave a cheer of victory. "We have met the enemy, and they are ours," he quoted. A snowball from the opposite fort struck him on the ear, and he sat down abruptly. Then the fight began in earnest. It was not until Chet had personally led his warriors out of their fortress and across the no-man's land between to win a glorious victory over the other army, and had personally washed the face of the marksman who had ruined his triumphant cheers, that peace was restored. Then, the forts having been demolished, the bobsleds were pressed into service again, and the hill rang with shouts and laughter until nightfall, for Officer Con Riley made it his business to attend to duties downtown for the rest of the day. End of Chapter 5.